Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned. Because it's Wednesday, that means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team-up that we do once a week. And this week, Roger and I have a tragic tale for you. The sad story of the superhero who lost his name. Which tragic superhero is this? Why, it's this guy. It's Shazam. Wait, that's actually Captain Marvel. It's Captain Marvel, who you might know as Shazam, even though that's not his name. At least it wasn't for a long time. Yes, Captain Marvel, the original Captain Marvel, the real deal, the big red cheese himself. Let's talk a little bit about Captain Marvel, the superhero who lost his name. We have the rise and fall of Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel, though, despite all of this character's setbacks, has proven to be pretty resilient. You know, he got a television show in the 1970s. Before that, he had a movie serial back in the 40s, I think it was. Fairly recently, we had two Shazam movies, which I didn't watch and I hear kind of sucked. But he's been around in media. And in comic books, he's vanished and reappeared a few times. Captain Marvel has, the original Captain Marvel. So Captain Marvel was a ripoff of Superman, frankly. Like many characters were back in the 1940s, in the golden age of comics. But Captain Marvel as a character, let's just say his powers were suspiciously similar to Superman's when he first arrived. And that is actually what got Captain Marvel into trouble. But before Captain Marvel got into trouble, Captain Marvel was very, very popular. Of course, Superman came before Captain Marvel. The greatest superhero of all time, Superman, came before Captain Marvel. And Fawcett Publications decided they wanted their own Superman. But they had a pretty good idea about what to do with this character, in that the secret identity of this character, Captain Marvel, would be a little kid. It'd be a little kid. So young Billy Batson is the secret identity of Captain Marvel. And young Billy Batson, newsboy Billy Batson, he meets a wizard. The wizard gives him the power to change into a superhero, an adult superhero, whenever he says the wizard's name. And what was the wizard's name? It was Shazam. So Shazam, not this guy. Shazam is actually a crusty old wizard who gave Billy Batson the power to become a superhero. And that happened in the very first story of Captain Marvel. Now, Captain Marvel was originally written by Bill Parker, and the artist was C.C. Beck. And he made his debut in February of 1940 in the unfortunately titled Whiz Comics. Yes, Captain Marvel showed up in Whiz. With this story, Captain Marvel, Whiz Comics proudly presents the world's mightiest man, powerful champion of justice, relentless enemy of evil, Captain Marvel. And here it is night in the city when Billy Batson runs into the Shadow. Wait, it isn't the Shadow, but it is a mysterious stranger. And this mysterious stranger says, "Why aren't you home in bed, son?" "I have no home, sir. I sleep in the subway station. It's warm there." So we already have a tragedy here. "Follow me," says the mysterious stranger. "Follow me," he says. And being an idiot, Billy Batson follows right along Well, this story can go to some very dark places, but it doesn't turn out to go to the dark places you might suspect from that beginning. Where are we going, says Billy. Wait and see. And the stranger brings him to this fantastic train. This train is awesome. Look at that. It's the kind of train you would expect to take you to a wizard. And it does. He goes down this long hallway where we have statues of the 7 deadly enemies of man, or 7 deadly sins, whatever you want to call them. And there, Billy Batson meets this old fella sitting in a chair by a giant globe. Welcome, Billy Batson, he says. How did you know my name? I know everything. I'm Shazam. And, a lightning bolt appears. Shazam! Crack! Simultaneously, a curious inscription explaining Shazam's name appears magically on the wall. So S is for Solomon, which means wisdom. H is for Hercules, which means strength. Atlas for stamina. Z, Zeus for power. A for Achilles, courage. And M, Mercury, speed. So you have all these attributes. And Shazam is going to give these attributes to Billy Batson. All my life I have fought injustice and cruelty, but I am old now. My time is almost up. You shall be my successor. Merely by speaking my name, you can become the strongest and mightiest man in the world, Captain Marvel. Speak my name. And he does. Shazam! Blam! And there he is, Shazam in his fancy outfit. He is now an adult superhero. So now, Billy Batson, every time he needs to become Captain Marvel, he just says the word Shazam. He becomes Captain Marvel, and he stops whatever horrible stuff needs to be stopped. He fights the bad guys. He does all that business, and does a lot of stuff which, exactly the same kinds of things that Superman was doing in his comic book. So we have basically Fawcett's version of Superman with a very clever secret identity. And I think in part, one of the things that made Captain Marvel's comic book so successful is this idea of a little kid who could become a grown man, a grown man with superpowers, which must have seemed like a really awesome thing if you were a little kid reading this comic book. That's way better than being a sidekick. The little kid actually turns into the hero. Now, back in these olden days in the 1940s, when Billy Batson turned into Captain Marvel, it wasn't like Captain Marvel was a little kid in a grown man's body. It was more like Captain Marvel was an entirely different person than Billy Batson. That changed years and years later, but that's kind of how Captain Marvel reads when you read the old issues. Also, Billy Batson had a pretty rough childhood and grew up quick, so that might have been part of it as well. But right away, Captain Marvel was a successful and popular comic book character, but he became hugely successful and popular as a comic book character. Kids loved Shazam, and at one point, Captain Marvel... Oh, kids loved Captain Marvel. See, even I get these names confused at this point, Roger. Kids loved Captain Marvel, and he was, at one point, even more popular than Superman, which seems crazy, but it's true. And Captain Marvel ended up as kind of the head of his own Captain Marvel universe. And these other Captain Marvel type characters showed up. We had Captain Marvel Jr., we had Mary Marvel there, and so they all got their own comic books and comic book stories. And it was fun. There's Mary Marvel kicking some ass there. That's pretty cool. And also Captain Marvel Jr., who becomes Captain Marvel Jr. when he says Captain Marvel, had his own comic book, which was very popular. And in fact, it was, if I'm remembering right, Elvis Presley's favorite comic book. And explains why Elvis Presley had those strange costumes in his latter years, kind of based on Captain Marvel Jr.'s outfit. And the interesting thing about Captain Marvel Jr. is that the stories seem to be a bit more serious, and they were drawn in a much more realistic style than the cartoony style that Captain Marvel's comic book was drawn in. And that's kind of interesting. Now, in my whole life, I've only read this one Captain Marvel Jr. story, because there are no collections that I'm aware of Captain Marvel Jr. Not that I'm aware of, anyway. And so you had the whole Marvel family, and Captain Marvel was hugely popular in the 1940s, but DC Comics sued them. DC Comics sued Fawcett because Captain Marvel was, frankly, too much of a ripoff, and Captain Marvel was becoming too popular and drawing some readers away from Superman to Captain Marvel. So something had to be done, thought DC Comics, so they sued them. And this lawsuit lasted a long time. And it wasn't settled until the 1950s, the early 1950s. And what had happened by then is, after World War II, superheroes started to become a lot less popular. All superhero comic books did. And all of a sudden, Captain Marvel was not, and the Captain Marvel comics just were not nearly as popular as they had been fairly recently in the 1940s. And with this lawsuit going on, Fawcett just decided, we'll just cease publication of Captain Marvel. And Captain Marvel comics were just done. They were done. They were gone, because it wasn't worth fighting DC Comics when the comic books that they were printing weren't making money anymore. DC soldiered on during this period of unpopular superheroes, or superheroes being unpopular. And so DC still had Superman published, still had Batman, still had Wonder Woman, Aquaman was still swimming around, Green Arrow was still around. That was about it until the Silver Age began with the Flash, with the new Silver Age version of the Flash. And then superheroes became popular again in the 1960s. But comic book readers remembered Captain Marvel, and a lot of comic book readers still loved Captain Marvel, even though he was gone. And while Captain Marvel was gone, and there were no Captain Marvel comic books being published, Marvel Comics decided, hey, we should seize this opportunity to make our own character called Captain Marvel, because we're Marvel Comics. And we want to make sure that if Captain Marvel ever returns, it's our version of Captain Marvel. So Marvel Comics stole Captain Marvel's name and made their own weird comic book character called Captain Marvel. So Marvel had their own Captain Marvel. And in an odd twist of fate, now when you think of the character Captain Marvel, you think of a Marvel Comics character, the one that showed up in the movies a few years ago. So Marvel Comics came out with their own Captain Marvel. And so, which was, kind of a jerk move, but understandable, I suppose, for legal reasons. The original Captain Marvel's biggest enemy was probably lawyers, Now, DC Comics, though, eventually got the rights to the character Captain Marvel, oddly enough. And in the 1970s, the original Captain Marvel returned. DC Comics brought back the original Captain Marvel. Now, they could not use the name Captain Marvel on the cover of the comic book because of Marvel Comics' Captain Marvel. So this is the issue when Captain Marvel, the original Captain Marvel, returned. As it says on the cover, it does say the original Captain Marvel. but the title was Shazam, and this is where the confusion started as far as what this character's name was. Inside the comic book, this character was Captain Marvel, but they couldn't use it on the title. In fact, even this one little line there, the original Captain Marvel, Marvel Comics had a hissy fit and sent a cease and desist letter. And, you know, lawyers are the one thing Captain Marvel can't battle. So they couldn't use that on the title anymore. Interestingly, when they brought back Captain Marvel, it was written by Denny O'Neil, but the original Captain Marvel artist, C.C. Beck, returned to draw the comic, which is really something when you consider it. So for 20 years, Captain Marvel, the original Captain Marvel, was gone, and now he returns. And that actually is explained in the comic, where one of the big evil villains from Captain Marvel, the original comic book, Dr. Sivana, came up with a scheme to put Captain Marvel, Mary Marvel, and Captain Marvel Jr. into suspended animation, and that's why they were gone for so long. But they returned. Now, before this happened, there was, in the Superman comic book, Superman fought a character called Captain Thunder, who basically was Captain Marvel. And I think that was kind of a test to see whether it would be feasible to bring Captain Marvel back. And so they did. And it was an interesting comic book. But it must have seemed odd for a 1970s audience. I'm sure the original fans of Captain Marvel who were still around, were, very happy to see the original Captain Marvel return with the original artist and everything. But for a lot of the 1970s kids reading this must have seemed pretty peculiar. Because basically, this was a golden age comic book being written and drawn in the 1970s. But a little bit more modern, but still kind of a throwback. So it must have seemed like something. And so it didn't last particularly long. And then Captain Marvel disappeared again for a long time. By the 1990s, DC Comics had full rights to the character of Captain Marvel. And they did bring Captain Marvel back. They brought him back in a mini-series, also written by Denny O'Neil, if I'm remembering correctly. He appeared a few times again before that. See if they have anything from that mini-series here. I'm not saying it. It's in here, though. But he came back for a mini-series by Denny O'Neil. But when he really came back was in a comic book called The Power of Shazam. And this was... the story was by Jerry Ordway. And it was a really, really good comic book when Captain Marvel came back in this comic. He had showed up in Legends, a miniseries, right around the time of Crisis on Infinite Earths. And Captain Marvel became a character on the Justice League as well. And in this newer version, in the DC's newer version of Captain Marvel, when he became Captain Marvel, had Billy Batson's mind. So he was basically a little kid in a superhero's body, which was interesting. And this was actually a really good comic book. Didn't last forever, though. And Captain Marvel eventually vanished from his own title again. He was still a part of the DC universe, though, which is a little ironic and odd in itself. Eventually, Captain Marvel returned again when DC Comics did the New 52. He appeared first as a backup feature in the Justice League, and then got his own comics. This was by Jeff Johns. And by this point, by the time Jeff Johns did the character, he was just called Shazam. And the feeling was everybody thinks his name is Shazam anyway. we will get rid of his name entirely. And now he is just called Shazam. He did have a lot of pals, though, join him in this comic book. And the comic book was all right. It was nothing to write home about. But it wasn't bad, and the artwork was good. But by this point, Captain Marvel is no longer Captain Marvel. He is just Shazam. Because, as Jeff Johns said, hey, everybody thinks his name is Shazam anyway. We might as well just call him Shazam. Now, recently, Shazam / Captain Marvel has made another return in a Mark Waid series. And I saw Mark Waid in an interview bragging about how he gave Captain Marvel his name back. But basically in the comic book, he's just called the Captain, which is not his name. His name is Captain Marvel. And so at this point, because of legal reasons, he isn't Captain Marvel. You can call him Shazam. You can call him the Captain, which just seems lame to me. But really, he's Captain Marvel, the superhero who still exists, but no longer has his name. Okay, guys, that's all I have to say today. I will catch you next time.